All right. So let's get back to take a look at how we do this. So foot and bar are pretty straightforward. All we're gonna do is just implement a random function, and in this case, because we don't need this, you can use the shorthand, which is.
Oh, we're frozen. We need to restart.
Oh,
yeah, just restart that section.
Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at how this could be implemented. So for and bar are pretty straightforward because they simply render static content. And since there's no data, no props, we don't need this. We can use the arrow function. Oh, wait. No, okay. So this is how we do it, right? So some people in chat has been asking about functional components, and this is in fact a pretty good candidate for functional components because this is like the purest form. It doesn't really depend on anything. So turning it into a functional component really is just simple as adding that. And you have a functional component. But this doesn't really help much because this doesn't really depend on any state or props. So we'll actually go back into 3.1 and take a look at this one. So our example component takes tags, and we're referencing the props via this.tags. The difference between a normal component or stateful component and a functional component is that normal components have an instance, but functional components do not have a backing instance at all. Functional components, as the name suggests, they're just, you can think of them as just functions. They take arguments in, they return virtual DOM out, that's it. It doesn't hold any state of its own. And in fact, in Vue's virtual DOM implementation, functional components are expanded eagerly. So if you use a functional component inside a parent component, this functional component's render function will be invoked eagerly inside that parent component's render function. So it's kind of expanded in line, which makes it extremely cheap because there's no overhead of creating a backing instance, holding all these data properties in place and everything. So the perfect use case for functional components is for performance optimizations when you have a lot of leaf nodes. By leaf nodes, I mean, for example, you have a huge list. So it's probably inevitable that you have to make each item in the list a real stateful component. But inside each of these components, you might have even more components. And those components can be purely presentational. For example, you're just rendering a button, or you're just rendering a static avatar or something, right? These components don't really have too much responsibilities in terms of state. They are really, some of them are used to encapsulate some styling. Some of them are just like markup, right? If you have these presentational components, which simply take some data, take some props in, and render some output depending on their props, then this seems a perfect candidate for functional components. And this will, and if these components are repeated in many places in your app, turning them into functional ones should boost the performance of your app. So let's take a look at functional components. All we need to do is really just add the functional true option. And it takes the same props declarations as normal components. The difference being that instead of accessing this prop using this, because we no longer have access to this anymore, this is passed in via a second context object. This is functional rendering context. So this context object contains a few things. So first, you can access context.props. So props will be held in this context. You can also have context.slots. When you call this, it's a function. When you call this, it'll give you resolved slot usage because functional components may also be used with slots, right? Even if an example is functional, you may be passing things here, right? So how do we access these? So they're passed in via slots, so you can use the same named slots or unnamed slots API. This will give you the same as this dot slots as in normal random functions. And you can also have context.children. So this is different from slots in the sense that this is the raw children. So anything, even if they have slot names on them, you'll just get a raw list of virtual nodes that's passed into this. So this is only used when you have really low-level concerns, like you want to do crazy things. But we're not going to talk too much about it here. And then you can access the context.parent, which is the context in which this the context in which this functional component was rendered in. In this case, the root instance. Remember, if you do something like this, right? If you're passing a functional component into another component via slots, usually if example is a stateful component, its $parent will be referencing foo here. However, in the sense of functional components, the context parent will be actually referencing the root instance here. It only references the context that this function was expanded in instead of its stateful parent. This is because, as we said, functional components are evaluated eagerly. So this is actually expanded before they're even passed to foo. So when we are here, the instance for foo isn't even created yet. So there's no way to reference it. Okay, so we got through that. And in here, so we see that it's cool that you can access props here. So this will become context.props.tags.map. And this completes our functional transformation. But we can simplify this a bit further in that we can use destructuring here. So props tags. So you can destruct multiple props here, like this, foo, bar. And someone find that it's annoying that you have to also explicitly declare props for functional components. And in the latest version of Vue, it's actually optional now. So you can create functional components that don't declare any props. It'll just collect all the things as props. And yeah, so this is a more concise version. And if you use JSX, we have an official Babel plugin called Babel plugin transform Vue JSX that allows you to write JSX, which allows you to do something like this. Ugh, it's complaining, but it doesn't like JSX. Huh? You can do something like this if you enable JSX in your app. And the cool thing about using JSX is you can actually declare your component this way. So usually when you declare a functional component, you declare it like this, right? Constant example like this. You still need this outer object boilerplate, declare functional true. So someone in the Vue.js team made a Babel transform called Babel plugin transform Vue functional component or something, which allows you to just write it like this, equals props and yeah, this is a. So essentially, yeah, you can treat them as just a one-liner function, and to make it look a bit better. So this is really just a function, and we'll recognize that this function is returning JSX, and we'll compile them into the full version here, and then compile all the JSX into H render calls for you. So if you enable that plugin, this is like the most concise form of functional components you can write. And it's very similar to React functional components as well. So I believe we've talked enough about functional components, and we're going to look at this. Finally getting to our exercise. So this is going to be bar. And we want to implement this example also using render functions, right? So this example takes a prop. OK. Well, in fact, we can make it functional and be done with it. But remember that we can directly return another component as our own root node inside one component. So in this case, what to return depends on this OK prop. So if OK, we'll return foo, and if not, we'll return bar. And this is pretty much it, right? And in order to complete the test, to pass the test, we need to implement a button. And yeah, this should put us through the test. Let me try that. Oh, OK. Expect it to match. It's in reverse, I guess.
You have to initialize OK to true.
Right.
OK in your model.
Ah, here, right. We didn't have this here. And right, OK, it doesn't exist in the root scope, so we need to declare that. And it passed. Great. So yeah, so essentially, this is again very concise, toggling between two components, and the fact that you can return another component as your own root node. So this outer component basically becomes, it doesn't render anything of its own, right? Which is interesting. Like, we can do more things in this component, actually. All right, so this leads us into the next topic, which is pretty common in the React world. It's a concept called higher order components. Okay, so it sounds pretty fancy. How many of you have heard of like higher order functions? Yeah. So in functional programming, you have this sort of you have an original function. You can take that function, compose it to return a higher order function, which does additional things, but still utilizes the original function internally. But that's pretty abstract. So let's try to think about what a higher order component could be in a more practical case. So let's imagine we have, let's go into 3.3, and we can see that we have this avatar component. This is a very, very simple component in that its sole responsibility is rendering some template. But in real world use cases, you might have additional things. For example, you have styling associated with it. You have a more complex DOM structure. But eventually, you want to hide this all away, abstract it inside this nicely reusable avatar component that you can use anywhere. And then when you use it, the downside is this avatar component is not that smart. It expects you to give this full URL to the image that it should be displaying, which isn't super nice. Like in some cases, for example, you are working with a system where you only have the username, and then you need to call an API to figure out what the avatar URL for that user is. Then eventually you need to pass it to this avatar component. If you put that logic inside a parent component that is using avatar, you're essentially polluting this parent component with some logic that it should not really be concerned about with, right? And this logic is going to be reused in a lot of places in your app because you don't want to be always passing in a full long URL. You want to just what you want is something like this, a smart component. All you need to give it is the username, and it figures out what the URL for this avatar should be, and then pass it into this internal avatar component for you. So this smart avatar is essentially a component that abstracts away some repetitive logic and separates that from both the parent context and this inner component. So a very dedicated piece of responsibility. this inner component is now very, very dumb. It doesn't care about any logic. It just takes some props and render it. Outer context is also unaware of anything going on. All it knows is I use this component, give it a username, it'll do the right thing. So this is a very nice encapsulation mechanism. And it's like composing different layers of responsibility with components, which is why this pattern has become very popular in the React world, because naturally render functions are closer to functional programming and makes these patterns shine. But because Vue can use render functions too, so there's really nothing preventing you from applying the same technique in a Vue context if you really enjoy this kind of composition. So let's take a look at our exercise. We have a mocked API function here. All it does is it takes a username and give you back an avatar URL inside a callback, and it fakes it with a 500 millisecond delay. And it always gives you the same URL, which is the Vue logo. So it doesn't really matter what username you pass in. It's just for faking an API call. And then we have this base avatar component. Okay? And then we have this smart avatar component, which we use like this inside our root instance. And we've set up everything else for you. What you need to implement is this function called with avatar URL. This is something more like so-called a component enhancer, or if you enable something like decorators, you can actually do something like this, which use this function as a decorator, so you don't have to call this something like that. But eventually, what this does is it returns another component, which is here, smart avatar. So it's essentially returning another component. And that component, this smart avatar component, should be internally rendering this at its root. But it should maintain the logic of taking its username prop, go to the API, find out the avatar for the inner URL, pass it on to the inner avatar component. And also, between the time where you're sending out the API and waiting for it to come back, you should be rendering the inner avatar component with a placeholder image. Does it make sense? So it's in the description. I think we can try to work on it now, or if people are really hungry, we can have dinner, or you can choose.
Yes. Unfortunately, they lost our order or something.
Really?
Yeah, so it's gonna be
God.
another 20 minutes.
All right, so let's just take a break. You can work on it if you want while we wait for the lunch. Okay?
We'll eventually get to eat, or else starve.
Okay. All right.
I'm
Yeah.
super starving myself.
Yeah. It's probably not a good idea to work
So
on hard
what should
stuff.
we do?
Let's just take a break. Yeah.
So 15, 10
10, 15. If the lunch arrives, we can just eat lunch.
Yeah.
If people want to work on stuff, they can work on it.
Okay, so if it doesn't come in 10 or 15 minutes, would you want to do another section or not?
We'll probably just review this exercise and then wait for lunch.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in 10 or 15 minutes,
Yeah.
we'll come, or 10 minutes, we'll come back and review the exercise then. Did you see the chat room at all? I don't know, there's a few.
Can you have logic that fetch order in the mixing? So, are we already cut? We're rolling? Okay. So there's a question in the chat which asks, can we have logic that fetch the avatar in mixin? Which is a good question, because it's more common to do this kind of things with mixins in the Vue world. The benefits of using a higher order component here is that you don't really pollute the inner avatar component. The inner avatar component can be used in other contexts. It can be enhanced by a different enhancer. So in this sense, higher order components offer a bit more reusability. But if that's not a concern, then using mixins are perfectly fine. Like you know this component is only used in this project, and it's a very specific task that's specifically for this project, then mixins are totally fine. But higher order components, in theory, provides a higher level of reusability, especially like when you want to reuse the inner component in as many places as possible. And another advantage is this makes the inner component more testable because it doesn't have any logic coupled with it. And you can test the enhancer and the inner components separately. Instead, with the mixing, you sort of have this only one component that kind of does both at the same time. So you either test both at the same time, or then you have a harder time of testing the two parts, the rendering and the data fetch logic separately. So I would say this offers a better separation of concern as well. But I wouldn't really recommend for using higher order components just for the sake of using it. It's really about realizing what problems you're trying to solve. Does it actually makes it better for your case? And sometimes mixing can really just be more easier to grasp because when you have too many higher order components, your component hierarchy becomes really complex and it can become harder to find out which responsibility falls where and figuring out how all of these enhancers are stacked together and how they interact with each other. And also when you have multiple layers of enhancers, you need to be intentional, you have to pass a lot of props down the way. And having more nested components also have some performance costs because you're now having more component instances in your app and more communication via props. All of these are overheads that you can avoid by using mixins. So you know the pros and cons of both approaches and pick the one that fits your use case. All right. Slots.